The Mafia boss who hides his love from the world but treasures the black bartender privately. The February cold pushed through the thin walls of the small apartment above the bar, but Celestine barely felt it. She stood in her robe, arms folded tight across her chest, her breath uneven as she stared at the man who had just shattered her life. Dominic didn't move. His expensive overcoat was still dusted with snow, his dark eyes fixed on her with a desperation she had never seen. On the kitchen table between them lay the deed to her building and a handwritten letter. His hands trembled, just slightly, as if he already knew she wouldn't believe anything he said. 9 months. 9 months of quiet nights, whispered confessions, and a warmth she thought she would never experience again. 9 months of trusting a man who held her like she meant everything to him. Now she knew the truth. The man she had been letting into her bed, into her heart, was the most feared crime boss in Chicago. And the people hunting him had found her first. A single question pressed against her chest like a weight. How did she get pulled into a world she never belonged in, and what would it cost her to get out? Tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and be sure to subscribe. Another powerful story drops tomorrow. Let's begin. Dominic Castellano stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the lights of Chicago stretching toward the lake in a cold, glittering sprawl. At 42, he had everything people claimed they wanted: power, money, influence, and none of the things that actually made a life meaningful. From the height of the Gold Coast, where the streets were lined with high-end boutiques and polished stone buildings, he looked down at a city he owned more of than anyone realized. The penthouse reflected the man, immaculate, controlled, and distant. Italian marble floors, a private elevator, a quiet that felt almost unnatural. When he returned home each night, there was no warmth waiting. No shared laughter, no soft voice, no presence to remind him that he was more than what the world feared. It didn't bother him, or at least that's what he told himself. He had built a life where detachment was survival. By day, he appeared to be the sharp and disciplined owner of Castellano Development, a construction empire with contracts throughout Chicago, Milwaukee, and northern Indiana. Developers, aldermen, and business leaders praised his precision. They admired the way projects under his name always finished ahead of schedule, the way his company avoided delays that seemed to plague everyone else. It made sense to them. Dominic was the sort of man who commanded efficiency with a look. But once the sun went down and the city turned harsher, his second life stepped out from the shadows. Dominic didn't inherit the Castellano family from a father who left a legacy of violence. He inherited it from a grandfather who arrived in 1952 with nothing but stubborn pride and a determination to carve out a space in Chicago's Italian communities. The old man settled near Taylor Street and began building connections, first small, then larger, until the Castellano name became one that demanded respect. Over the decades, the operation grew. What started with gambling dens behind grocery stores and backroom deals in narrow alleyways expanded across state lines. Dominic's leadership pushed it further than anyone before him dared. Under him, the family ran operations stretching from Gary to Milwaukee, gambling networks, distribution routes, protection fees from businesses that wanted safety but had no one else to turn to, and a money laundering system woven through construction sites and shell companies. Every man in that world knew Dominic's reputation. A word from him could save a life, or end one. He didn't shout. He didn't rant. His silence carried more danger than a raised gun. Stories passed through the ranks about his temper, though few had ever seen it firsthand. Most described him as a man without emotional openings, someone who didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, and didn't allow himself to feel anything that could make him vulnerable. The truth was simpler. Dominic had trained himself not to need anyone. Growing up surrounded by threats, betrayals, and the unspoken understanding that softness could get you killed, he had molded himself into something unshakable. Relationships were temporary. Affection was exchanged for convenience. The women he dated were glamorous, sophisticated, and chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with emotional connection. They looked good on his arm, smiled at the right events, and disappeared before sunrise. None of them stayed the night, and none of them asked why. Inside his world, People whispered that his heart was long gone, if it ever existed. A man that powerful couldn't afford to care about anything other than strategy. Love made people careless. Attachment created vulnerabilities. The castle of Castellano, as some jokingly called him, remained locked away from everyone. That was the life Dominic accepted. Until the night a tired bartender in Bronzeville poured him a drink without asking his name. Celestine Monroe had never set foot in the Gold Coast. Her world existed several miles south on 47th Street, in a neighborhood with deep roots and deeper resilience. She didn't wake up to a skyline view or step into polished marble hallways. Her mornings began with the soft hum of old refrigerators, the creak of wooden floors that had held decades of foot traffic, and the faint scent of cigar smoke soaked into the walls long before she was born. At 34, she managed Velvet Lounge, the bar her grandmother opened in 1961. It had once been a hub for local musicians and community leaders. Jazz legends had played in its corner stage, and neighborhood activists had held meetings downstairs during times when people needed a place to plan, argue, and hope. Every inch of that bar carried a history Celestine guarded with fierce devotion. She had grown up believing she would leave Chicago. She earned a scholarship to the University of Illinois, excelled in her business courses, and built a promising career in corporate marketing. For 5 years, she commuted downtown in tailored blazers, sat in sleek offices, and presented strategy plans to clients who barely looked at her. But when her grandmother's health declined, she didn't hesitate. She resigned, traded boardrooms for bar rags, spreadsheets for sticky floors, and moved back to Bronzeville to preserve the only legacy that mattered to her. Celestine worked 16-hour days without complaint. She cleaned, cooked, repaired what she could, and stretched every dollar until it nearly split in half. Most nights she barely broke even. The neighborhood faced constant pressure from property sharks and developers looking to flip historic spaces into high-end condos. Crime drifted through the area, pushing customers away. Yet she stayed. She had calloused hands to prove it, tired eyes that still carried warmth, and a spirit that refused to give up the place her grandmother built by hand. Her appearance reflected that mixture of strength and softness. Her mahogany skin glowed even under the dim lights of the bar. Her deep brown eyes carried flecks of gold that sparkled when she laughed, something she didn't do as often anymore. Her natural hair was kept in twists pinned neatly, a style she could maintain even on the longest days. She didn't dress to impress. She dressed to work. Romance was not part of her life. She didn't chase it, didn't expect it, had long ago accepted that her routine left little room for anything resembling intimacy. The men who flirted with her were usually drunk or passing through. She kept her heart buried beneath duty and exhaustion. Velvet Lounge needed her. The neighborhood needed her. Anything beyond that felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Still, there were quiet moments, closing shifts when the street was silent, or nights when she sat on a bar stool staring at the neon sign out front, when loneliness crept into her thoughts. Not loneliness for a partner, but for a connection, someone who looked at her and saw more than a woman keeping a failing bar alive. She pushed those feelings away. Life demanded focus, not longing. She didn't know that miles away, in a world separated from hers by money, violence, and distance, there existed a man who felt the same emptiness in a completely different way. The contrast between their worlds was absolute. One man lived above the city, ensconced in luxury and surrounded by danger. One woman worked in a historic bar, holding a neighborhood together with grit and grace. Nothing about their lives intersected, not geography, not social circles, not backgrounds. Yet the universe has a strange way of bringing opposite lives to the same doorstep. On a Tuesday night in February, when the wind cut through Chicago like a blade, Dominic drove without purpose for the first time in years. His usually structured evening had ended in bloodshed. A meeting had gone wrong, 3 men were dead by his orders, and the city suddenly felt too loud, too close, too suffocating. He needed somewhere quiet. Somewhere anonymous. Somewhere he could be a man rather than a name people feared. That search brought him south, far from his usual haunts, to a corner of 47th Street where a lone neon sign flickered through falling snow, Velvet Lounge. Inside, Celestine was preparing to close early. The streets were empty. The wind made the windows rattle. Her hands ached from work. She was wiping down the counter when the door opened. A tall man stepped inside. Snow clung to his hair, clinging to the broad shoulders of a dark coat. His expression was unreadable, but exhaustion hung around him like a heavy coat he couldn't remove. He didn't demand attention or swagger the way some men did. He simply walked to the bar and sat. Celestine didn't ask questions. She poured him a glass of Maker's Mark and slid it across the counter. "Rough night?" she asked. He looked up, surprised by her tone, gentle, not probing. "Something like that," he replied. She didn't know his name. He didn't offer it. But when he finally did, he said, "Nico." A name he hadn't used in years. A name only his mother had ever spoken with affection. That night, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way either of them recognized. But a connection sparked between two people who didn't realize how much they needed it. Their lives were about to collide in a way neither could have predicted. The stage was set, a crime boss carrying the weight of a violent empire, and a bartender carrying the weight of a family legacy. Two worlds that should never have touched were about to meet on a frozen Tuesday night, and nothing that followed would be simple. The Tuesday she remembered most felt like the city itself had stopped breathing. The cold had weight, the kind that pressed through coats and gloves and made even the street lamps look exhausted. Celestine stood behind the bar, rubbing warmth into her fingers while debating whether to close early. No one sane was out in weather that sharp. She had already wiped down the counter twice, humming under her breath to fill the empty space, when the door opened with a slow push that let in a blast of air cold enough to sting. A man stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying that heaviness people wear after too many sleepless nights. Snow clung to the collar of his coat like he hadn't bothered brushing it off. She didn't know he had come from a meeting that ended in violence, or that three men were cooling on the concrete floor of a Southside warehouse because he'd ordered it that way. She only saw a stranger who looked like he'd lost an argument with the world. He took the stool at the far end, not the center, not the one near the window, someone accustomed to choosing positions that kept his back protected. But his expression wasn't sharp. Just tired. Frayed at the edges. Without a word, Celestine reached for the Maker's Mark and poured 2 fingers. She didn't ask what he wanted. She somehow knew that he needed something warm, something steady. He lifted the glass with a faint nod. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice low, almost rough. "Long night?" she asked. He hesitated. Not stiffening, just trying to find something to say that didn't give away a life he wasn't supposed to speak about. "Yeah," he said. "Long day. Longer year." She smiled at that, a small, honest curve of her mouth. "Happens to the best of us." He should have given her a false name, one he used for business, one that kept distance. Instead, something else slipped out. "Nico." She froze for half a heartbeat. Not because the name meant anything to her, but because it felt like a piece of him he hadn't meant to offer. Something softer. Something rarely shared. "Well, Nico," she replied, "you picked a good night to hide out. No one's crazy enough to come drink in this cold." A faint sound left him, almost laughter. It surprised him as much as her. Their conversation drifted from nothing to everything, carried by the hum of the heater and the quiet shelter of an empty bar. He asked about the jazz posters on the walls. She told him half of them were originals from her grandmother's collection. He asked how long she'd been running the place. She told him she was still learning as she went. She asked nothing personal of him, and somehow that made him want to answer more than he should. It was the first time in years he let his mind settle, even for a moment. He stayed until her closing routine forced him to stand. He slid $100 bill across the counter. She frowned at it, but he only gave another small nod, almost shy, as if he didn't know what else to do with gratitude. When he stepped back out into the frozen night, Celestine locked the door behind him, unaware that this weary stranger would return the next week. And the week after. His return became a rhythm before either of them admitted it. Not scheduled, never predictable, but steady. Some weeks he appeared twice, other weeks only once. Always late. Always alone. No driver, no shadow trailing him, no security detail waiting outside. For a man who lived with danger welded to his name, anonymity should have been impossible. Yet in her quiet bar on the edge of Bronzeville, he managed it. Celestine never asked why he came so often. She only noticed how he relaxed the moment he walked in, just a subtle shift of his shoulders, the faint loosening of a man who rarely allowed himself to soften. Their conversations stretched over months, slow as honey, unforced. She talked about her grandmother, whose quilts still covered half her small apartment. She talked about how the bar used to host live jazz sessions, about the history of the neighborhood, about the way she wanted to restore the stage one day when she saved enough. He listened. Really listened. More than any man she'd known. He told her bits of himself, though each truth wore a small disguise. He said he worked in construction, often with difficult clients. He mentioned he had no close family. He admitted he spent far too many nights working and not enough simply living. There was sadness in that admission, one she felt but didn't press. He never bragged, never tried to impress her, never hinted at the wealth or power he carried outside her door. And she never suspected the weight of the choices he made once he left her glowlit counter. One night, well past 3 a.m, she was mopping behind the bar while he lingered at his usual stool. Snow tapped against the window like fingertips. She told him she was tempted to close early again. He smirked lightly. "Would have ruined my night," he said. "You say that like you had high expectations," she teased. He shook his head. "I only had one." She paused mid-swipe. "Which was?" "That you'd be here." Something inside her chest tightened, not in fear, but in a way that reminded her she'd been lonely far too long. When she finished cleaning, he didn't immediately stand to leave. Instead, he held the door for her as she dragged the trash outside, helped her break down empty boxes, and carried her broom back inside like it weighed nothing. The hour between 3 and 4 felt suspended, timeless and strangely intimate. She leaned against the counter, catching her breath from her closing routine. He stepped closer, slowly, giving her every chance to move away. She didn't. Their first kiss wasn't planned or hurried. It was tentative at first, almost cautious, a gentle brush of mouths that deepened only when she reached up and touched his jaw. His breath hitched, not from desire, but from something deeper he hadn't expected to feel. When they finally pulled apart, she whispered, "I don't do casual. I'm too old and too tired for games." His answer came without hesitation. "Neither do I." He hadn't meant to confess that. And yet it was true in a way that startled him. In that dim bar, surrounded by empty glasses and muted neon signs, Dominic, Nico, felt a shift he couldn't name. Something moving inside him, quiet but impossible to ignore. The shift between them didn't happen in a single moment. It grew through repeated nights when Nico stayed after closing, not rushing away the second she locked the door. Celestine didn't invite him to her apartment immediately. She didn't trust easily, and she'd spent too many years guarding her peace with deliberate care. But the night her heat went out, some old building issue she'd been putting off, she accepted his offer to walk her home. She didn't want to be alone in the cold. He didn't want to leave her walking 5 blocks with a wind that stung like needles. Her building was small, old, and solid. 3rd floor, no elevator, narrow stairwell with peeling paint. He followed her up without comment, though she caught him scanning everything with the quiet focus of a man who noticed details instinctively. She didn't think anything of it. Men in rough neighborhoods often stayed aware. She didn't know it was second nature for him. Inside, her apartment was warm despite the failing heat. Plants filled the windowsills, books occupied every shelf and half the floor, and quilts her grandmother had made were draped over her couch. The place smelled faintly of cinnamon and old fabric softener. It felt lived in, cared for, Nothing like the penthouse he kept stripped of everything except necessity. "This is you," he said softly, taking it all in. She shrugged. "It's small. It's real." His voice had a depth she wasn't used to hearing from him. They shared tea at her wobbly kitchen table, both pretending not to notice the steam rising from their cups because their hands were cold. He asked about the quilts, and she told him about her grandmother teaching her how to fix loose threads when she was 6. She spoke about her business classes, the job downtown she gave up, and the way she sometimes missed the predictability of corporate life but never its emptiness. He listened like the world narrowed to her voice. Later, when she shivered slightly, he reached out and placed his hand on her arm. Not possessive. Not demanding. Just warm. She leaned into him. That simple movement changed everything. Their second kiss was deeper, slower, and heavy with the things neither of them said out loud. When they ended up in her bedroom, it wasn't rushed or careless. He touched her with an intensity he didn't fully understand, as though learning the shape of something he'd feared he would never have. In her bed, the mask he wore for decades slipped without him noticing. The cold, unshakable control he lived by dissolved. He held her carefully, almost reverently, like she wasn't just a woman he wanted but a woman he needed without knowing why. He traced the curve of her shoulder, the line of her back, memorizing her with unsteady patience. She ran her fingers through his hair, feeling the tension in him melt inch by inch. Hours passed in a quiet he didn't know he craved. For the first time in his life, he slept somewhere that wasn't his penthouse, a hotel or a safe house. He slept beside someone who didn't fear him, didn't ask anything from him, didn't know his world. He woke before dawn, the city still silent, Celestine tucked against his chest. He studied her face, the softness around her eyes, the way her breathing steadied him. He had no right to stay. No business wanting this. But the truth pressed against him harder than the morning light creeping through her blinds. He wanted her. Not for a night. Not as an escape. As something permanent. And that was the first sign of danger. The kind he couldn't eliminate, couldn't control, couldn't silence. Not without losing her. From that night forward, something irreversible settled between them, quiet, steady, and undeniable. Dominic still arrived without notice, sometimes twice a week, sometimes after a long stretch where she wondered if he'd vanished for good. Yet every time he walked through the door, she felt the same pull in her chest. Celestine never asked what he did for a living. He told her he was in construction, owned a small company, nothing special. She believed him because he never looked like a man who lied. He had a way of speaking that felt direct, careful, and unembellished. A man exhausted by life, not performing for anyone. But she noticed the details he didn't realize he gave away. The way he positioned himself with his back never fully exposed. How he watched exits. How he scanned faces in the bar without turning his head. How his hands were steady even when he was clearly worn down. She didn't interpret it as danger. She interpreted it as a man who lived under constant pressure. Meanwhile, his world, his real world, shifted in ways he didn't expect. His territory captains whispered about his absences. His consigliere questioned why he insisted on driving alone. His family members, the few he still tolerated, assumed there was another woman from his usual circles. He let them think that. The truth was too precious to expose. One night, after a meeting in Little Italy stretched past midnight, he broke his own rule. Instead of heading home or to a safe house, he drove straight to her bar, long after closing. Her lights were off, but he saw the glow from her apartment window upstairs. He climbed the stairs, stood outside her door for a long moment, then knocked. She opened it wearing old pajamas and a head wrap, surprised but not alarmed. "You okay?" The question slipped from her effortlessly. No expectation. No pressure. Just genuine concern. He didn't answer. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and rested his forehead against hers. She placed her hands on his chest, grounding him without knowing just how much he needed it. He had spent decades surrounded by men who feared him, respected him, or wanted something from him. No one in years had touched him without calculation. Celestine gave without hesitation. That terrified him more than anything. They sat on her couch wrapped in one of her grandmother's quilts, her legs draped across his lap as she braided a loose twist in her hair. He held her ankle gently, tracing slow lines across her skin, thinking about how easy it would be to destroy her life simply by existing in it. "Long day?" she asked softly. "Long year," he murmured. She smiled in that calm, steady way that always unraveled the tension in his jaw. "You can stay here tonight. You don't need to talk. Just rest." He had never been offered something so simple. Rest. Safety. Quiet. Not from a woman. Not from anyone. He stayed. That night marked the first time he realized she wasn't just a comfort. She was the only part of his life untouched by violence, fear, or expectation. Something he couldn't replace. Couldn't replicate. And because of that, he should have walked away. Instead, he sank deeper. Dominic managed his double existence with the same precision he used to run his empire. By day, he moved through Chicago's elite circles wearing the role everyone expected, the polished businessman with an impeccable suit, a controlled smile, and a reputation for unwavering discipline. He attended charity galas, shook the right hands, and made generous donations that kept his company's name in headlines for all the right reasons. When photographs were taken, he stood beside elegant women who fit the image. Women chosen for their discretion, their poise, and their ability to blend seamlessly into his public life. No one questioned him. He didn't allow missteps. His mask never slipped. But in Bronzeville, walking through the door of Velvet Lounge, he became someone else entirely. Nico. A man who didn't carry the weight of a crime family on his shoulders. A man who could sit at the bar with a worn jacket and talk about things he never discussed with anyone. He watched Celestine move behind the counter, confident, focused, completely at home in a world nothing like his own. He learned her grandmother's recipes because she laughed when she caught him peeking in the kitchen once. He started helping her close the bar and balance the books, using a calm voice to guide her through expenses she'd been too overwhelmed to tackle. When her bar insurance payment nearly wiped out her savings, he cleared the balance anonymously through a shell company she'd never heard of. He told himself it was practical, that he was protecting her livelihood. But the truth was colder and more dangerous. He simply needed her world to stay standing because he couldn't function without it anymore. Months passed, and he started staying overnight without planning to. He'd wake in her small bedroom with the morning light touching her shoulders, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Comfort. Peace. A longing sharper than anything he'd experienced. He made coffee in her tiny kitchen, the pot too small for a man used to industrial machines. He left quietly when she went to open the bar, kissing her slowly at the door, promising he would see her again without specifying when. Celestine noticed his contradictions. His expensive watch paired with the same plain jacket. The calmness in his voice contrasted with the tension in his posture. The way he avoided details about his life but somehow always had the means to help her without hesitation. She wasn't naive. People in her neighborhood learned to respect private realities. Everyone carried something, burdens, past mistakes, unfinished stories. She didn't push him for answers, even when questions nudged at her mind. She fell in love anyway. It happened quietly, in moments that seemed insignificant. The gentle touch at her waist when he passed behind her. The way he listened with steady focus, like her voice was the only thing anchoring him to the present. The way his hand found hers during old movies, not seeking attention, only closeness. She didn't admit it to herself all at once. It crept in, soft but certain, filling the spaces she thought she'd closed off years ago. She fell in love with the man she believed he was, Nico, the quiet stranger with haunted eyes and a tender touch. She had no idea the truth could destroy her. Dominic had built a life on the belief that attachment was a weakness. He'd seen too many men fall because they cared about the wrong person, trusted the wrong voice, or let love cloud their instincts. His father was one of them. killed because he let a rival close enough to learn his vulnerabilities. Dominic spent the next 20 years doing the opposite, cutting off anything that resembled softness, refusing warmth, refusing connection. But Celestine pushed through defenses he didn't realize were still standing. He found himself thinking of her during strategy meetings, hearing her laugh while he negotiated territorial expansion, remembering the softness of her skin in moments when he should have been focused on survival. He knew it was dangerous, knew he was slipping, yet the pull toward her kept tightening. What scared him more was the shift happening inside his own mind. The work he once saw as necessary started feeling heavy. He used to be able to order a man's execution without blinking. Now he left meetings drained, imagining how Celestine would look at him if she knew what he'd done to reach this height. He couldn't bring her into his world, but couldn't imagine leaving hers. He lived in two separate realities. During daylight hours, he endured high-ceilinged boardrooms, political lunches, and the sharp calculations of men who would betray him at the first sign of weakness. At night, he returned to Celestine's apartment, where the air smelled like lavender oil and worn cotton, where she kept an extra blanket folded neatly over the back of her couch because she hated when guests felt cold. The contrast was disorienting. He bought her small gifts that wouldn't expose him, things that fit naturally into her world. A new sound system for the bar she assumed came from a grant she'd applied for months ago. A rare first-edition Langston Hughes collection that arrived anonymously because he knew she'd never let him spend that kind of money on her. Cash tucked quietly into her maintenance envelope when she complained the pipes were leaking again. He wasn't trying to buy her affection. He was trying to repair the things he could control because he couldn't fix the one thing that mattered most: his own damn life. Celestine sensed the contrast in him. He was gentle, attentive, present, yet carried a tension that never eased. The way he held her at night felt like a man protecting something he feared losing. She knew he wasn't being honest about everything, but she also knew he cared for her deeply. That contradiction confused her, but didn't stop her heart from moving toward him. She convinced herself that it didn't matter what he was hiding as long as he treated her with respect. She'd grown up around men with secrets. Brothers who worked 2 jobs while doing things they never spoke about, neighbors who had side deals that kept the lights on. Survival required silence. Communities thrived on unspoken agreements. Nico, she believed, was carrying burdens he didn't know how to share. She didn't want to pry them open. Yet she couldn't ignore the moments when fear flickered in his eyes. Or the nights he arrived looking like he'd fought the whole city and barely made it out. He always claimed exhaustion, but exhaustion didn't explain the rawness in his voice or the hollow sorrow beneath it. She loved him anyway. She chose him long before she admitted it to herself. Dominic knew the fragile balance would collapse eventually. He had avoided public exposure for months, always careful to keep his worlds separate. In the Gold Coast, he was the unflinching Castellano, the man who commanded respect with a glance and crushed rivals without hesitation. In Bronzeville, he was Nico, a quiet presence in her life, someone who laughed at her stories, helped with her finances, and held her through nights she feared would never end. The fracture became clear one chilly evening in a downtown coffee shop. Celestine had insisted on meeting a potential supplier for her bar renovation, and Nico had agreed to walk with her. He dressed in a simple coat and scarf, attempting anonymity. She watched him navigate the crowd, saw the careful way he avoided recognition, and felt a pang of unease. She realized he was always careful, always hiding, even when they were together. And yet, she'd never questioned him directly. Until that day. He walked past her as if she were invisible, shaking hands with a man she didn't recognize, his expression tight and unreadable. Celestine's heart raced. She followed him to the exit. "What are we doing, Nico?" she asked, voice steady but eyes sharp. "Am I your girlfriend? Your secret? Something you're ashamed of?" He stopped, facing her fully for the first time in weeks. "I'm not ashamed of you," he said, but there was weight in his tone, a confession that carried both truth and restraint. "Then why don't I exist when we're not in this room?" Her voice was quiet, but every word landed with precision. The question hung in the air. He opened his mouth, hesitated. Explaining would expose her to dangers he could never forgive himself for bringing into her life. "I can't explain," he admitted finally, a tremor betraying his control. She felt something crack inside her, the foundation of trust shaking. "I think you should go," she said, stepping back. Without a word, he left. The cool Chicago air enveloped him as he disappeared into the night, leaving Celestine with a mix of relief, fear, and heartbreak. Every step he took away from her apartment had been one more piece of himself that he left behind. Every choice to protect her meant a sacrifice of intimacy and closeness that he could never reclaim. 3 weeks passed in silence. No letters. No phone calls. The apartment felt emptier, the bar quieter, even the city itself seemed distant. Celestine threw herself into work, focusing on every detail of Velvet Lounge, trying to forget the man who had entered her life and disrupted everything. Then a stranger walked into Velvet Lounge carrying information that would change everything. Photographs, surveillance details, a folder that confirmed what she had only suspected. That Nico was Dominic Castellano, the man whose name could make people fear and obey. Her carefully constructed world shifted in an instant. The weight of secrecy, protection, and love collided. Celestine understood now that her connection with him was no ordinary romance. The stakes were higher, and the consequences of their bond could be lethal. And yet, even knowing this, part of her still longed for him, still believed in the moments they shared, still hoped for a way to bridge the gap between the worlds he had built and the life she fought to protect. 3 weeks of silence had changed everything. Dominic's absence had grown heavier with each day, and Celestine felt the weight of it in every corner of the Velvet Lounge. She focused on her work, meticulously organizing the bar, balancing budgets, and keeping the legacy of her grandmother alive, yet even as she moved among the familiar tables and shelves, her thoughts repeatedly returned to him. Meanwhile, Dominic's presence in Chicago had grown more formidable. Reports filtered through his associates, decisions executed with sudden brutality, a temper shortened to sharp bursts. The quiet dominance he wielded now sharpened to a visible edge. The city's underworld sensed his intensity shifting, though none guessed the cause. Celestine's world cracked wider the day Patricia Delgado walked into Velvet Lounge. A woman in tailored gray with sharp eyes that missed nothing, she placed an envelope on the bar with deliberate care. "I have an offer for you," Patricia said, voice smooth but measured. Celestine's brow lifted. The sum inside would have bought the building 5 times over. Her immediate reply was firm. "This building has been in my family for 60 years. I won't sell." Patricia's expression remained calm as she laid a folder across the bar. "Your friend Nico, or should I say Dominic Castellano, might have a different perspective," she said. Inside were photographs, clippings, and surveillance reports. Images of Dominic at charity events, in private meetings with figures who demanded fear and respect, arriving at her building in the early hours of the morning. The folder implied a choice. Sell the building, or these images would reach people who would exploit the vulnerability he had kept hidden. Celestine's heart dropped. The man she had loved, trusted, and confided in, the one who had held her close through long, quiet nights, was at the center of everything she had avoided acknowledging. Her world, so carefully constructed, felt like it had been built on fragile glass. She sat with the folder in her hands, the weight of realization pressing on her chest. She did not hesitate. She picked up her phone and dialed the emergency number he had given her months ago. Within the hour, he was there, leaning against the doorway of the bar. His eyes, usually so controlled, were gray with worry when he saw the folder. "I know what you are. I know what you've done," she said, voice cold and steady. She stepped back, leaving space between them, as if the distance could shield her from danger. Dominic took a measured step forward. "Celestine." She raised her hand, cutting him off. "The threat. The photos. The blackmail. Everything about my bar and my neighborhood, you've left me exposed." He closed the distance carefully, voice low. "I love you." Her response was deliberate, each word measured. "Then prove it. Fix this. Protect my bar, my neighborhood. And then stay out of my life forever." He nodded, understanding fully the demand she placed upon him. There was no room for hesitation. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rhythm, unaware that beneath the surface, a war was about to be waged that would reshape the order of Chicago's underworld. Dominic moved quickly once the parameters were clear. His first task was identifying the source of the threat. The Moretti family of Detroit had been observing him for more than a year, waiting for a crack, a weakness. He had expected challenges, rivalries, and betrayals, but never that the vulnerability of the woman he loved would become a weapon against him. Over the next 6 weeks, he mobilized his network with precision. Decisions were made with ruthless efficiency, a combination of strategy and instinct honed over decades. Men loyal to him carried out targeted operations across Chicago, tracing communications, intercepting messages, neutralizing key players within the Moretti faction. Dominic's presence became a shadow over the city's criminal landscape. Cars were found abandoned near the river, offices emptied overnight, powerful figures disappeared, and those who hesitated never returned to challenge him again. The brutality was swift, surgical, leaving no openings for retaliation. Patricia Delgado, the woman who had attempted to manipulate Celestine into compliance, met her end in the cold waters near Navy Pier. Dominic's calculation left no room for error. Every move had to protect Celestine and the Velvet Lounge. Her bar remained untouched, the neighborhood shielded as best he could, while the chaos he wrought ensured that those who sought to harm them paid the price. Yet, the campaign did not go unnoticed. Federal authorities began observing patterns, rumors of disappearances and connections to organized crime filtering into their reports. Witnesses who had previously remained silent were emboldened by Dominic's audacity, surfacing evidence and testimony that had been buried. The FBI moved carefully, piecing together the extent of his operations and influence. Through all of this, Celestine watched from the Velvet Lounge, receiving word through carefully placed allies. She understood the stakes but remained resolute. Her bar, her neighborhood, her family's legacy. None of it would be compromised. She remained firm in her demand. He had to protect what mattered without drawing her directly into the conflict. The culmination of the campaign arrived on a bright September morning. Federal agents moved on Dominic's penthouse in the Gold Coast neighborhood. He was arrested without incident, calm and collected, as if every part of his life had prepared him for this moment. Racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder, 12 counts that carried severe penalties, were read, but Dominic's demeanor betrayed nothing. He had expected consequences, yet his priorities had always been clear. Celestine's safety and the preservation of the Velvet Lounge outweighed any personal cost. Before he was escorted away, Dominic ensured that one final message reached Celestine. Through his lawyer, he delivered an envelope to the bar. Inside were the keys and deeds to the Velvet Lounge, fully paid off, along with 3 adjacent properties, allowing Celestine to expand and secure her family's legacy. A handwritten letter rested atop the documents, his handwriting precise and familiar. In the letter, he admitted his errors, the trust he should have offered, the secrets he carried, the dangers he had exposed her to. He wrote of the love he had for her, a love that had changed him more than any empire or act of power could. Everything he had done since she discovered his identity had been to protect her, not to reclaim her affections. The instructions were clear. The buildings were hers to cultivate, to honor the vision of her grandmother, and to create something lasting in a city that had too often forgotten its own history. He concluded with words that carried the weight of every decision he had ever made. She was the only real thing he had ever possessed, and she would remain in his heart forever, even behind bars. Dominic Castellano was led away, the noise of the city rising behind him, but his presence lingered in Velvet Lounge. The bar, once merely a family business, now carried the proof of his devotion, the physical representation of a love that had survived brutality, deception, and unimaginable risk. Even in confinement, Dominic's influence persisted. Celestine held the letter close, knowing that while freedom had been taken from him, the choices he had made had preserved her world. Chicago's streets might continue with their rhythms of ambition and danger, But in Velvet Lounge, a quiet victory had been achieved, a victory of care, of protection, and of a love that refused to bend to circumstance. The transition was complete. Dominic would face 45 years in federal prison, but Celestine's world had not been claimed by fear or compromise. The city remained, the bar remained, and the promise of their connection endured in letters, in preserved spaces, and in the knowledge that some truths could survive even the harshest tests. Dominic was moved to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, 300 miles south of Chicago. His arrival drew no fanfare, and he made no attempts to explain himself to the media. He refused to speak to reporters, never cooperated with authorities, and showed no sign of public remorse. Each day was measured, disciplined, and detached from the outside world, but the letters he sent each month carried small glimpses of concern. Questions about the bar, the neighborhood, the life Celestine was building. He never asked for responses, nor did he seek forgiveness. These messages were his quiet way of remaining present in her life, even when he could not be beside her. Celestine, in contrast, poured herself into the work she had started long before his arrest. Over 2 years of silence, she transformed the Velvet Lounge and the surrounding blocks. Using the resources Dominic had left her, she began revitalizing Bronzeville, converting adjacent buildings into a community center, after-school programs, and spaces for small businesses. Young entrepreneurs launched their ambitions from the structures she preserved and nurtured. Despite her focus, Celestine occasionally allowed herself moments of normalcy. She dated men who were kind, reliable, and available, yet none of them could replace what she had shared with Dominic. Each relationship was a reminder of what she had lost and of the love that continued to exist, untouchable but enduring. 5 years after that frozen February night when Dominic first walked into Velvet Lounge, 3 years into his sentence, a letter arrived for him. Celestine had written briefly, carefully balancing understanding with caution. She acknowledged the dangers he had tried to shield her from, without offering full forgiveness. Her words described the progress she had made, the bar thriving under her care, the community center now open, and even a nod to his grandmother's recipes, still preserved and shared as if time had not touched them. The letter confirmed what Dominic already knew in his heart, that what they had shared was real. Despite all the lies and hidden truths, love had existed between them. Celestine concluded with a decision. She would visit him next month. Not for promises, not for reconciliation, but to see him, to hear the complete truth straight from his lips, and to confront the life they could not share freely. Their story did not end with a simple reunion. Both understood that real love was only the start of a more difficult path. The Velvet Lounge continued to glow on 47th Street, its neon sign a constant against the city night, while a man in Marion, Illinois, waited for visiting hours, holding her letter, scented faintly with jasmine. Some chapters had closed, but others were still being written, each one fragile, uncertain, and entirely theirs. Dominic and Celestine's story carries a series of lessons that reach beyond their own lives. Keeping parts of oneself hidden can feel like protection, but secrets, when left too long, grow into burdens that threaten everything you hold dear. Dominic's power and wealth had given him control over an empire, yet none of it mattered when he realized that freedom to share life with someone he loved was impossible. Love, in their experience, proved complex. It did not cleanse guilt or excuse violent choices, yet it could exist within circumstances full of risk and compromise. It required honesty where possible, courage to confront danger, and the willingness to embrace vulnerability without expectation of a fair outcome. The community around Velvet Lounge reflected another kind of truth. Investment, care, and persistence can breathe life into places left behind. Celestine's dedication transformed not just buildings but the neighborhood itself, creating spaces for young people to grow, for history to be honored, and for culture to thrive. Finally, their story shows the courage in both leaving and returning, when actions are deliberate rather than impulsive. Two people found something real in a quiet bar on 47th Street, something that neither power nor circumstance could erase. Both were changed, carrying the weight and beauty of what they discovered. In a neighborhood the world had overlooked, they proved that commitment, love, and integrity could survive, grow, and endure, even against impossible odds. What do you think Celestine should do next? Fully forgive Dominic or guard her heart? Share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us where you're watching from. If you haven't subscribed yet, do so now to support more stories like this. Your support brings these powerful tales to life, and tomorrow we'll share another story you won't want to miss.